I see a few more of our guests joining. Just as an opening for our audience today, we are trying something new starting today, and we're so excited to have Katie kick this off for us. We're doing a deep dive. It's almost an unconference approach to having a conference. We wanted to go deep into a program in a real world or a topic. In a real world, we would have set up perhaps a half-a-day conference or workshops and such. And then given where we are with COVID and lockdown, we decided maybe we want to do something different. So starting today, the next 3 weeks, we are diving into artificial intelligence and trying to understand what has happened with artificial intelligence and how it has progressed, particularly during the last few months. But I don't want to give away the entire story. I'm going to hand this off to Lynn, who is going to chat with Katie and also introduce Katie, because we are incredibly lucky and thrilled to have Katie. Lynn, over to you.
Thank you, Jagathi. And as Jagathi mentioned, we're super excited to introduce this deep dive series. This is the first of the series. And, we hope that you walk away with a deeper, slightly advanced level of understanding of certainly AI with this one, and as we proceed forward with the rest of the year and so forth. So this one, we're going to talk about AI, obviously, and we've got some questions for Katie. But then the next one, we'll dive into AI solutions design. And we hope that you sign up for all three of them today and the other two. So the next one, I believe, is October 21, which we'll announce at the end. So I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Katie King. Katie and I met in Dubai, 3 years ago. The story is in a hot tub, but that's for later. Katie is a Brit who is a published author, a keynote speaker, a trainer, and consultant on artificial intelligence. She is this is a tricky one, 2 TED Talk presenter. I got it out. She's got 2 books on AI, which we'll put in the chat box. She's also a member of the UK governmental all-party parliamentary group, which is a task force that is really devoted to AI adoption, which I think is so interesting because as we move forward, the adoption of these technologies is becoming a bigger issue than we may have anticipated. So without further ado, Katie, welcome. We are so honored to have you. And didn't know if you wanted to say a few words before I ask you some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lynn. I appreciate that. Greetings from London. It's a pleasure to see you all. I'm just love to share experiences. As Lynn said, I wrote this book. It was a year of hard work, and if I'm being completely honest, the objective of it was to future-proof myself. So I'm 53, I've been consulting for 30 years. You can see behind me, there's some big brands there, but you have to keep pivoting and learning and staying curious. And so the book was an attempt, and it succeeded, to get to grips with a technology and to interview some of the world's biggest brands, tech disruptors, politicians, and some really cool people. And it's worked. It's led to meeting people like Lynn. It's led to keynote speeches all around the world. And so I do a mixture of those kind of things. And so my journey into AI, we'll probably talk about that in a moment, but it's kind of happened in the last 5 years or so. So I've got a few slides, but happy to keep this really informal, really honest. I'm not trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes that AI is being implemented at scale, because it's not. So, I'm going to give you the honest view. And because of the all-party parliamentary group, not only am I drawing on experience from the book, but I hear evidence every few weeks from people all over the world about this very subject. So it's kind of like I've got my fingers, in the fingertips with the latest stats and case studies and so on. So I should be able to share that with you.
Well, very exciting. So tell us about your journey into AI and how you actually, got to write a book about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Can everyone see my screen okay, by the way?
We can.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. So as I mentioned, it's 30 years I've been doing this kind of consulting. I've got one limited company, which is Zudica's Consulting Limited. And I've been doing digital marketing, and we all know with COVID that digitization has really accelerated. So I'm not saying necessarily that AI has accelerated, but certainly getting onto Zoom, digitizing your business has really been accelerated in the last 6 months. But I've been doing this for about 12, 15 years. So I was at the cutting edge of digital and digital marketing, TEDx talks, commenting on TV and helping companies actually implement it. And it was through that I got into AI. I saw, that it was really burgeoning about 5 years ago. It seemed exciting. Marketing seemed to be one of the early disciplines that was toying with AI. And so that's how I got involved. I wrote a white paper for the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, which was a deep dive into AI in the built environment. So future cities, property construction, that kind of area. And it's from there that I decided if I'm going to stay ahead, if I'm going to stay and get still earning money from 50 to 60 years old, I need to do something. And that the book, has really helped me do that. So yeah, that's really a little bit about that journey, Lynn. Thank you.
Oh, great. So can you tell us, I know, this group is fintech related. Can you sort of define for us artificial intelligence, and where and how do you see it impacting fintech businesses? Because that's really what we're focused on. But then maybe at the end, a little bit about other businesses or industries that you're seeing.
Yeah, most definitely. I think that's really important. And I think that starting by being clear what we mean by AI is really, really important, because there's so much hype. If you think about the Gartner hype cycle, we've been in that peak of paranoia and confusion because the press haven't had loads of case studies to draw on. No, not so many facts. They've turned to myth. And so really, in a nutshell, we're talking about a family of technologies, not just one technology, but a family of technologies where the machines have the capability to imitate our human intelligent behavior. So it's all about big data. And a subset of this family of technologies is machine learning. And with this, we've got algorithms, which really just a set of instructions through computer code, and they are enabling the machine to keep accelerating its learning. The more big data, the more instruction it's giving, it's learning as we go through. We'll come on to some of these other terms at the bottom maybe a little bit later, but you've got this family of technologies that ranges and actually intersects with other fourth generation tech like Internet of Things. But we're really thinking of things like interactive AI for call centers, where big brands, small organizations are using chatbots, smart virtual assistants on websites, things like text recognition, your Siri, your Cortana. Some of those are embedded into Facebook and what have you. And then when you move into the bigger areas like driverless vehicles, then you're into computer vision and augmented reality and so on. So that's kind of like a brief overview of some of those technologies. So how are they actually being implemented is a great question, Lynn. And I've got a few examples I wanted to share with you. So I work with a lot of CEOs, and one of the, not criticisms, but one of their frustrations with the world of AI is that there are sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of these technology startups. So AI is viable today and hasn't been for about 7 decades. It's viable today because we've got the big data, and it's viable because we've got the processing power. And so all of a sudden, you've got these startups. Here's an example of one of them. They've developed this AI-based virtual assistant, and it's all about regaining your financial health. So it's reducing credit card debt, student loans. It's really diagnostics to help people make decisions about their spending. So it's that kind of thing that we're looking at. Also, ID analytics. So in fintech, there's a lot of focus on fraud. So it's scoring new applications. We've got an American Express using it for chatbots through Facebook Messenger. So it's really the automation. I call it the 3Ds: the dirty, the dull, and the dangerous. So it's those kind of automation of tasks that we've either struggled with or we're bored by. And if you think of cloud computing, which we've had for 10 or 12 years, this is the next layer of automation. Whether you're in banking and financial services, whether you're in the law or retail, whatever industry sector you're in, and actually whatever job function you're in, there will be AI tools either available today or coming soon that will be able to automate many of the things that we do. So human being and AI tools together really is augmented intelligence. And that's what we're really talking about. So here we've got the bottom bullet point, Singapore Bank using AI-powered chatbots, efficiency. And what they do is they train the bot with the best customer experience people, and it can handle 85% of those routine queries, and then they can escalate maybe the other 15% of them that are more complex, to be handled by a human agent. Couple more quick examples. So in my book, I feature banks like the Royal Bank of Scotland. And I had a brilliant interview with the head of AI for RBS, which is also NatWest and Royal Bank of Scotland. And he talks here about really personalization. And in my book, I've got a whole chapter on this, which is the paradox of personalization. And what AI enables us to do with this big data insights is to delve deeply into customers. So historically, he's saying here, head of AI, Royal Bank of Scotland, banks and big organizations got criticized for not knowing the customer. And now, whether you're a bank or a retailer, you can no longer just be very homogenous and say female, 55, British. You can say Katie King comes into my bank or into my restaurant on a Thursday evening. She's got a daughter of this age who's going to university, her spending patterns are this, or she orders ribs when she comes into my restaurant, but her daughter's vegan. So this kind of like deep layer of personalization is what we're able to get. Another really important area in banking and financial services is bias. So you can see here in the final bullet point, more than 1 in 5 Black individuals. You've got a lot of issues all over the world with, potential discrimination of race, of gender, of where you actually live. And that's a big one in the UK, postcode lotteries. And so AI, if used properly, has got the potential to help avoid that traditional credit reporting and scoring that actually can sometimes perpetuate the bias. So, but of course, if the AI is fed with the wrong data, or, if you're an HR team and you're feeding the AI with your same views that you've had for the last 20 years, you're only going to hire the same kind of people. So it's important that the data set is eclectic, is unbiased, is mixed to enable that to actually happen. So here's a look at some other sectors as well. You've got financial services included here, but there are others. So Lynn, you asked about other sectors. Take telecoms at the top. Down the left-hand side, we've got the industry sector, and across the top, we've got how are they actually adopting AI. Telecoms is a good one. So big telecoms companies like British Telecom, they historically can look back and say, when the weather gets bad in November, it gets really cold, the broadband lines freeze, and we need 10,000 engineers in our vans to go out and do the repairs. They can do the predictive analytics about the weather patterns, and they can use historical data using AI. And then one final example there down the bottom, retail. Go across, 52% of that being for marketing and sales. And it's that level of personalization that I mentioned there. Basically knitting together all the disparate data and being able to serve customers really detailed knowledge. So that's really just a couple of examples. And the tools, I mean, there are many of them, but this is a tool that some of the retailers are using called Amperity. And if you give consent to the organization to use it, then actually it can pool 4 million visitors and give them a very personalized experience in the restaurant or through email, over the internet, for example. So, that's just a few examples. But we're not yet at that plateau of productivity. We've been in the innovation, we've gone into that hype. And we've gone into the trough of disillusionment. So Saxo Bank was a good bank that I interviewed in Sweden for my book. And they basically said, it didn't work for us. Staff felt threatened and clients felt it was gimmicky and didn't quite do what they expected. So yeah, there's a few examples, Lynn. Hope that's helpful.
Yes, well, Katie, you said an awful lot there that was, I thought, very relevant to the discussion. We have had some speakers on FinTech Women who've actually talked about some of the categories that you mentioned, you know, whether it's savings or your school loans or whatever it is, you know, getting that data on your phone and making decisions, making new FinTech technologies. We also, you know, one of the things that surprised me in Dubai is the robots that are in the banking centers that actually come out to the edge of the retail outlet and say, you know, may I help you? It's a robot, which is quite interesting. I haven't seen that in the U.S. here yet. I'm sure it's on its way. And then things you talked about, sort of the retail. I have a friend at Amazon, and it is so compelling to me to, you know, who knows what I need to order before I order it? You know, oh, hey, I think you need paper towels. Yes, yeah. I actually do. So that's, you know, it's becoming frightening on one hand, but very relevant in this business. We had two things in the chat, which I thought were really interesting. Someone, I think it was Lilium, said, Roger Penrose, just laureated with Physics Nobel Prize, wrote an interesting book to define AI in a very math concept, The Emperor's New Mind, concerning computers, minds, and the laws of physics, which is very interesting.
Very.
And then, yeah, then Kay Mooney wrote something in a similar vein that Stephen Hawking, who I, you know, loved his work, the rise of AI will either the best or worst thing to happen to humanity. We do not know which. What do you think are the biggest concerns about using AI? And I have one more question, but I think it delves right and segues really nicely into the next question. And I do think that, you know, there are a lot of macro issues, and I think one of the biggest concerns for me personally is this invasion of my privacy in a sense. And that's only one. But can you talk about some of the other big sort of macro issues that need to be addressed in AI, whether it's ethics, governance, which, you know, you are working on a committee, or consent?
Yeah, all good, really good questions, absolutely, and we'll definitely address the Stephen Hawking one. So we have GDPR, yeah, in Europe. We have GDPR.
Does everybody know what GDPR is?
Yes.
Okay. I think
so we've got our regulations for data consent, and it's really, you know, it's pretty far advanced, and it's fantastic that we have that. So one thing I would say is that the law and these guidelines and these new laws and existing laws, there's a lot of confusion. And the law doesn't always catch up or stay at the same pace as technology. Sometimes it lags behind. We're seeing that still with social media, aren't we? With all of the issues of Facebook and, you know, etc. So in GDPR, we have a clause around explainability. And I think of the example of insurance. So what we don't want, we need explainability and transparency, because what we don't want to happen is for the AI to make a decision and say, Katie, you live in this postcode, you're this age, you can't have a car loan. You know, you can't have insurance for that lovely new car you bought. Typically, it's going to be a younger person of a certain demographic and maybe of a certain color that often are on the receiving end of those decisions where they're denied. And we need to know why the AI has reached a certain decision. So again, back to not allowing the AI to operate completely independently, but to have the human in the loop and to have that transparency. So the GDPR says you need to be able to explain to that person why that decision has been reached. So that's really, really important. So it's that balance of explainability and accuracy and so on. So, you know, I guess what we're seeing here is the potential for technology to surpass the law's ability to govern, and you've got this sort of regulatory gap. But what I'm finding is some countries, and you mentioned Dubai there, Lynn, and then of course we've got China and we've got the US. People have got different ways of handling this, and it's a huge problem internationally, because what's the jurisdiction and the law in the UK versus America, even in the UK, Scotland, England, Ireland, it's very, very complex. And so what we have to really think about is balancing innovation and regulation. And if we go too far down, which sometimes in the UK, we're trying to be this barometer for regulation and AI for good and all these incredible initiatives, and then we might miss out on being super competitive. So it's a fine balance. And safeguarding and those sorts of issues become really important. Wanted to draw your attention to this. This is OECD led, but you've got Australia, Canada, the US, which is fantastic, obviously the UK as well. And this partnership has been founded to try and safeguard human rights and fundamental freedoms and shared democratic values. So I think this, which was only announced in June of this year, is a big move forward. So that's encouraging to see. So as far as, some of the big areas, I mean, ethics is really important. AI for good is really important. I just had an initiative with schools, and I wanted, because I know it's going to take quite a long time for the school curriculum to change. And in the meantime, young people, before they go to university, are learning and have got a big gap. And so there's all these kinds of initiatives of AI for good in India and other places. Initiatives like mine, which is closing the schools there. I brought in Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, the Alan Turing Institute, and a bunch of other people to give their time for free, virtually over Zoom, to teach these young people about how AI is going to reshape the subject they're interested in, be that finance or fashion or marketing. And we need more of that. But certainly regulation in this space, in fintech is really, really crucial. But it's that balancing act. And the trade bodies, the governments are there on the one hand, but I think it's important for companies to work with their trade bodies and to help the regulators to define, what's required, and to actually be quite proactive in playing a role in that. Let's not sit back passively and wait for this to come to us. We've all got to play a role in defining what that looks like.
Great. Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. There are so many issues. One of we're getting some items in the chat box, and one of them is that I think a couple people here are saying that, top of mind is the bias, whether it's the FICO score or something else. To me, those are the enormous issues to overcome. And, I guess those are some of the things that I look at, that your point about everybody has to be involved. It's really a collaborative effort to get everybody interested in the issues. And I don't know how easy that is going to be, but certainly the governing bodies that you're working with in the UK, they seem to be a little ahead of the US in most cases.
Well, a couple of years ago, the House of Lords came up with a guideline, like a code of conduct with 5 key points around, explainability and democratization and fairness and so on. But that's just guidelines. And then, of course, we've got existing laws that are being slightly adapted. And then we've got new regulations as well. So I think it's a mixture. Of course, it's government specific, but I do think trade bodies can play a role with the regulators to help, define what this looks like. And, we're on the ground starting to implement it, and it's quite new. So we should be the ones that are consulted when we are, deciding how this is going to pan out. I think that's really important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly having spent a fair amount of time in China there, with the draconian government as such, the laws are, not followed. And that's a scary environment. So hopefully we can avoid all that. What I was going to do at this point is open it up to questions. So I don't know if people want to unmute yourself. Katie, that was fabulous. Did you have something else here? Let's go through this.
Yeah, no, I just had one important one. I thought, because for a lot of people, just is one final slide really, and then we'll go to kind of Q&A, but lots of people always say to me, how do I get started? So, you haven't read my book, but if we not you, Lynn, but everyone hasn't kind of read it, but if we distilled it down into one slide, it would be this. And the book does cover, fintech, but other subjects and sectors too. And this is my scorecard, and it's a really good guide for you to think about, how do I get started? And that's about mindset, buy-in from the board, doing a business case, doing some proof of concept, collaborating with other departments, sourcing the talent or reskilling, making sure your culture supports it, innovating, and then what we were just discussing there, thinking about the wider impact, working with your industry bodies, ethics, and then finally the roadmap. And so I won't kind of spend too long on that, but I just thought, as we're having the Q&A, let's maybe have that there, and it's something to think about. How do I get started? Like, it's a wild west out there. A lot of CEOs describe it as. So I thought that might be, quite useful to have there.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are a couple things in the chat, and if anyone has a question, you can raise your hand, and we'll let you join the conversation. There were a couple questions about gender bias as well as determined with Amazon AI recruiting tool.
Yeah, well, interesting. I don't know huge amounts about that, but about that tool. But certainly, as I mentioned, gender bias, and racial bias, and all kinds of areas like that. AI has the potential to really eradicate that, but equally, AI has the power, if it's fed wrong, to fuel that and to make it worse. So again, it's down to people. It's down to data scientists within a team that are working with the domain knowledge experts, that might be all different job functions, and together they need to think about the proof of concept and think about a particular issue they're trying to automate, and work together to ensure that happens or doesn't happen. Now, when you buy a tool in from outside, you've got to do your due diligence, because you've got to know that I'm not going to be buying something that's potentially going to do that. So, there's a lot of things to think about. I don't want to ignore that question you mentioned earlier as well, Lynn, about the Stephen Hawking. And it was a good one. It was a good point. So let me just stop sharing my screen now. So he talks about, or I talked about, AI could be our greatest ever,
he says the best or worst thing to happen.
Best or worst, biggest ever dream or our worst ever nightmare. Anti-aging, disease eradication. I mean, we've seen with COVID how AI in healthcare is helping to shorten the life cycle of 20 years often for drug discovery. We haven't got it yet, but we're closing in, aren't we? Down to a year or maybe 18 months. So he was right. There's the potential for it to be incredible. But then you move into the other darker side, which is maybe that singularity, the potential for machines to surpass us, to take over. He said we've all got to go to another planet because in 100 years the robots,
He and Elon Musk, right? He and Elon Musk are going to the other planet, I guess. But
totally, you've got Jack Ma, Alibaba, and Elon Musk are at the pole end. And Stephen Hawking was kind of sitting on the fence saying both. But all I would say is that from some of the best brains in the world at MIT, UCL,
Cambridge,
academic,
UK,
these people I interviewed for my book, they were all, on the whole, very positive about the future, and certainly didn't feel that in their lifetime that was going to happen, and that we were a million miles away from that ever happening. So we've got narrow AI currently, but AI could potentially do everything, but not one AI, not one robot that can do what us humans can do, but multiple different robots, chatbot assistants who individually can do lots of different, can do one thing. So one robotic arm flipping the burgers in a restaurant, a chatbot program to help a bank with customer inquiries. There are multiple different devices that can do individual things very, very well. That's a million miles away from, our human brain. And I think what I would anticipate is, as we crack neuroscience and how we understand the neurons in the brain and how they work in time, that might happen. But I don't believe it's 20 years away, or even 30 or 40, 50 to 100, but maybe never.
Jagathi, well, I don't know if any, go ahead, someone had a question.
Jagathi again, because there are so many questions buzzing in my head. Both of you were talking about international, right? You were talking about Jack Ma, you're talking about China, what's happening. And Katie, you sit in Europe, right in the middle of the, well, depending on how you look at the global map, right in the middle of the world. So there's been lots of conversation and talk that China might get ahead of the rest of the world in terms of adopting and executing, largely because there is the way the regulations, the way they can access data, it's easier for them than many of the Western countries. I'm being very polite in how I'm saying this. If you were having a drink, I would have said something else. But there's that, and then the other kind of more interesting thing I read not too long ago is that when an article, or whether it's scientific or commercial article, comes out in a language that's not Chinese, there's a very fast pace at which that gets translated and then made available to the Chinese technologists, scientists, and such. So their access to what's happening globally in these spaces are far faster than many of us in the West think. So I guess I want your thoughts on that from what you're seeing.
Yeah, it's certainly, I was going to say, quite worrying. I mean, it feels, a lot of people saying, and I've seen some recent statistics, it does differ depending on the latest report, Deloitte, Gartner, et cetera, but it seems as very much that the US and China are way ahead of the rest of the pack. You've got Europe, you've got parts of the Middle East, you mentioned, Lynn, Dubai, and some really exciting things they're doing. It feels as if for the size of the country of China and for its politics, its regime and so on, that it has the power to really go way ahead. And one thing we haven't touched on, of course, is the power of AI to be used from a defense perspective. And we've heard Putin in Russia say that he who cracks AI, will be the future rulers of the world. So, that side of things is worrying. And that's why I pointed to that global partnership, that slide earlier. That's so important, is that we come together internationally at a time where, I'm not saying we're becoming nationalistic, but at a time with Brexit and with all kinds of issues and with COVID, we've all got a bit more back into our little national bubbles, probably at a time when we need to be collaborating most around these kinds of technologies. But the China thing, worries me too. And I have met with some incredible Chinese AI companies like Squirrel AI, who are doing some really exciting work with AI in the education space, where, again, they're opening up learning to young people using AI and saying, well, the teacher, you've scored badly in this particular test, go away and read this book, go away and try this, go away and learn that. And it becomes kind of really personalized. But, that's a big issue. It's a difficult one to crack, Jagathi, because, these countries are operating independently. So we need like a global treaty, but then countries don't always stay involved in those global treaties, as we all know. So, more of those kinds of initiatives are required, but I'm not being in a utopic bubble and, saying that will continue, because this is about commerce, and being ahead for a lot of countries and for a lot of organizations.
Lynn, I have a quick question. If I may, just tied to what you talked about, Katie, regarding the regulators. Experimentation for innovation is critical in this space, in every industry, but, fintech for sure. And I'm curious as to whether you have any experience or knowledge around the success of the UK's Financial Conduct Authority Sandbox. That seemed like a really interesting concept where regulators and innovators, startups would come together and experiment ideas and technologies live, almost like a proof of concept live as they were putting regulation together.
Yeah, no, I haven't got specific experience of that, to be completely honest with you, but I've heard a bit about it, and I think you're absolutely right. I think that's essential, that continuous evolution, and the need to again balance that Wild West, because for a lot of people the bit that's missing is the glue in the middle of it. So it's great that it's innovative and it works and it's exciting and so on, but you do need to know that it can work and it can protect and so on. So no specific experience of that, but in principle, I agree with you. That's essential that we keep bringing in that light. Now, we're either talking here of the big vendors, IBM Watson, Amazon Web Services, Adobe Sensei, Microsoft Azure, or we're working with all the exciting, fintech startups that are very active in this world of AI. And I think they need to come together. Due diligence needs to be done. And that's what we do. We hear evidence at the House of Lords from these kinds of organizations. They can't just kind of like pitch up commercially, they need to be put through their paces. But then it's down to the companies who are going to buy their services, to do their due diligence. And I think the trade bodies can then play a role in helping make that decision a little bit easier for them.
Thank you.
Question, if I may, Katie. Based on your observations, what do you think some of the less mature practices are in the development and implementation of AI? And based on those observations, what would you say are the largest gaps in governance and risk management?
Yeah, really good question. I think, honestly, would say that it's quite early days for a lot of organizations. It feels as if what's missing is the bigger picture strategic plan. I've seen lots of ad hoc activities. I've seen, examples of, like I say, of the chatbots, of AI being used in their finance department, in their, in their marketing. Nothing's at scale because it's too new. And what I think's missing with a lot of them, and a lot of people admitted to me, even very big organizations, we were told by our CEO to open up our shopping bag and buy AI. And that's what's missing for me, is that strategic approach to it, and that minimal viable product, and the proof of concept, and then all of the piece that goes around that, of the safeguarding of the regulatory side of it. So all of the pieces of the puzzle are thrown up in the air, and only a few of them are landing at the moment. And I think that's the danger, and that's why it hasn't really taken off at scale yet, because people don't have the confidence to know exactly how all of the bits fit together.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I have a question, Katie, if I may.
Yeah, hi, Donna.
Hello, thanks so much. This is a terrific discussion, and I'm eager to buy your book.
Great.
Can you talk a little bit about what you heard in the interviews you did about how these leaders are thinking about training for talent? That was one of the mindset topics. How are companies thinking about developing talent in their organizations to evolve AI?
Good question. And in fact, McKinsey, I talk about talent, as you can see in my, it's just gone now, but in my point 6 there, McKinsey have said that they've done a lot of research into the companies that succeed best with AI. The top one was that they have that strategic plan in place. The second was the data. And the third was that they train their people. And so to answer your question, I'm doing a lot of training with CEOs and teams and so on. And people are, I think part of the issue is that the HR team or the learning and development team don't know what they don't know. And the people that need to be implementing a training program don't necessarily know what's required. So I think, again, it's a bit messy. It's not foolproof yet, but I think you've got to have different levels of training. You've got to have pros and cons of either outsourcing the AI. So if you are in-house and you're doing the implementation at a technical level, then you've got to ensure you have the skills already, or you bring in some of that by a third party, or you use some tools. So there's that kind of data science, machine learning kind of training. But then there's the training for the board, for the management team, to understand this is part of our 2, 3, 5, 10-year plan. We've got to really understand this. We don't need to know how to code, but we need to understand the implications legally, from an IT perspective, the impact on marketing, sales, so they need to know the impact this is going to have on the organization. So there's that level of training. There's training the HR people so that they know the kind of training they should be deploying. And then there's the kind of teams, like the marketing teams, the finance teams, and so on, who need to understand how AI can impact their individual job function, irrespective of the sector they're in. So there's a whole different range of training, but people don't yet have that big picture view of it, and I think that's part of the problem. Which is why I don't think it's yet at scale, really, in many organizations.
Yeah, I was going to say that, it requires a cultural transformation for many companies. And I think with, COVID, it was the start of sort of a Zoom world. And, many companies had to pivot and sort of, just lost traction for a few weeks. I think things are moving much more smoothly for companies, but I think JP Morgan said it last week, productivity is down.
Yeah.
And I think now the idea is that, if it's down 30-40%, the idea is that we have to use these technologies. I think people have been afraid to say, hey, I want to learn a new technology. I want to learn about AI because you need to get your job done. It has to be a cultural transformation for companies. And I think those that make that cultural transformation will transform and will be the successful companies. But you're right, they're doing it very slowly.
Yeah, you're right, Lynn. And without the digitization phase, without the big data that comes from digitizing, you can't do AI. Because to do AI, you need good data. Right. And so you don't get that if you're not using smartphones, if you're not, fully digitized and so on. So, I think COVID has accelerated that. It took, certainly in, my space in Europe and some other countries I work with, Japan and other countries, it took about 6 weeks, for companies to get their business continuity and resilience in place. And that was a long time. I can see why productivity is down, because it took months. But it's definitely bounced back in the last month or so.
Great. And I'm going to put your book in the chat so everybody has it. Any other questions?
Yeah, it's not so much a question, Lynn, as you're beginning to wrap up. But what I'm realizing is, as I hear Katie speak, there is, and we probably need to build out this story in FinTech Women as well. There's a theme I'm seeing when we heard about data being the fundamental, when HP came and spoke to us about data and how it's being used. And then from there, we had Tracy and Kristen last week talking about regulatory aspects of having FinTechs join, FinTechs work with larger organizations. And then now Katie bringing all those little pieces, the fundamental connectivity between these technologies, and not just technologies, but also the functions behind them, because you also mentioned HR and trainers. They don't know when you're bringing in talent, how do you bring it? And it's just making me think, and it'll be great to get some feedback from our audience too, as several of you have been hearing so many of our sessions. What might get you folks excited? Because I think that the connectivity is so it's so, the connectivity is so all of these topics are so integrated, and the connectivity is there. And when we think about these topics in silos, sometimes we miss the big picture. So it was really good to hear you, Katie, speak about bringing all of those things together when you speak about talent and several of the other points you made.
Thank you. Yeah, most definitely.
So without further ado, don't forget to sign up for the second of the three-part series, which will be October 21. And thank you all for joining. Katie, wonderful to see you again, and hopefully
And you
next time in
too.
person.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone. Keep
Bye-bye.
safe and well. Thank
Yeah,
you.
you too. Be
Bye.
safe.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.